Lenses are kind of like girlfriends. You learn to love the qualities and quirks that come with them being a part of your life. What's going on, guys? I'm Yeshaya, this is FireFace Films, and today we're talking about why I use vintage lenses over modern lenses. But before we do, make sure you drop a like, get subscribed, and click that bell to get notified when we post. Alright, on with the show. As of late, I've found myself poring over tons and tons of videos, articles, and data about possible cine lenses I'd want to add to my kit. And the overwhelming conclusion I come away with is that none of these lenses are scratching the itch of what I'm looking for. Now you might ask, how can that be? The market is chock full of good lenses, to which I say, yeah, it is, but they aren't what I want. And one of the first big considerations is cost. For all the vintage lenses that I use for my work, I've spent about $1,600. And when you're talking about cine lenses, $1,600 might get you one lens. And these days, yeah, it'll get you one lens and maybe two if you're on the budget end. Furthermore, my vintage lenses have optical qualities that just straight up aren't in modern lenses. One of the things I don't really find myself caring about that a lot of people do is chromatic aberration. Now, yes, I know chromatic aberration is a thing that you definitely don't want to see in certain situations, but for what I'm filming and for most of my work, and granted these lenses don't have crazy chromatic aberration, it doesn't really come up. Now, yes, if I wanted a more modern and clean lens that doesn't have that, I might be out of luck, but for what I do and how I work, it doesn't really affect me. And then the thing that I really enjoy about these vintage lenses that most definitely is not on modern lenses is more polygonal aperture shapes. Like most of these lenses have anywhere from 5 to 7 to at most 11 aperture blades, and that's only on these more semi-modern-ish zooms. And I think that lenses having those polygonal aperture shapes adds the individual character. Everyone is chasing after more and more round apertures, and I feel like that's detracting from individual lens character. I mean, one of the most famous Zeiss lens sets of all time, this one specifically here, has a triangular aperture, and that's something that people absolutely love. And more importantly, more famously, I would say, is like, if you watch The Dark Knight, within the first few minutes of that movie, on the IMAX sequences, they're shooting with lenses that have 5 blade apertures, and that's very clear to see. And it's one of those things that just adds to character, you know? If everything, all these lenses across the board continue to have more round aperture blades, you're losing an individual character. And that's what these vintage lenses have. Yes, modern lenses have their own character, but vintage lenses have a character that I think is more apparent and actually speaks for itself rather than moving towards emulating vintage optics and having sharp character, if that makes sense. Okay, so here's some footage that I actually shot with these lenses, and it cannot be overstated that I just love the way these lenses render images. I love the flares of them, even though they aren't demonstrated here. I love the not too sharp nature of them. I like the slight warmth that they render with, and I really do like the lower contrast nature of these lenses, as that can really affect the way that you light something, right? And then the compact size of these lenses is a plus, although that is not as much of a special thing anymore, as cine lenses are coming smaller and smaller every day. And I gotta say, this is more of a real subjective thing and something about my own taste, is that these lenses really aid in my vision of crafting less contemporary images. Like, it aids in my personal vision of shooting in a manner that evokes pre-2000 imagery. Like, if you watch those movies, they have a definite look, and when you use lenses that are from that pre-era, it helps you get closer to that, and that's something I'm striving for in my imagery. Okay, now let's actually have a look at these vintage lenses next to some modern lenses. Now, disclaimer, I'm comparing vintage photo lenses to modern photo lenses, so there's a bit of a discrepancy when comparing against modern cine lenses, but the overall sentiment and idea will still stand. Okay, so here's where the comparisons start, and the thing I notice across the board is that all of the Nikons render the image slightly more softly and a little more warmly, which I do enjoy. All of the Sonys here are a little more neutral and a little cooler and definitely sharper. And with the 35 and soon to be 55 here, you notice that when they're wide open, they have a little bit of a blooming, loss of contrast, and softer image, which that's not ideal if you want to shoot wide open. But I don't shoot wide open very often. So to me, what I'm seeing across the board is that I do like the characteristics. Now, of course, it's always up to taste, but having a little bit more of a malleable image with these vintage boys is very nice. All right, now let's talk about some possible cons of working with vintage lenses. One of the first big ones is that finding usable lenses can be a bit of a gamble, as the condition can be a massive concern, whether you're talking about the actual physical conditions of the lens or the actual glass composition and condition of the lens, as you can run into a lot of stuff like separation, yellowing, haze, fungus. I mean, there's a lot of things that can go wrong when you're picking out vintage lenses. And it's like winning a lottery when you get one that's right. But trying to sort out through all kinds of stuff is a hassle. And then most of the time, these vintage lenses don't have obvious markings to denote what it is. And what I mean by that is, like, when you're using a cine lens, it's gonna have very obvious marking on the side to say, hey, this is the 35 T2, whatever. Now, I'd say this is more of a concern if you're on set where other people other than yourself have to use the lenses. For example, my Nikons, they only identify what they are on the front ring the lens, whereas that's going to be a little bit awkward for someone else to have to constantly like look up and see what they are. But you can counteract that by doing what I do, which is marking the tops of the lenses with what they are: 85, 2.0, 55, 1.2, this, that, and the other. And I've actually run into this on set already, where my AC would be like, what lens are we using here? And I'm like, it's on the lens cap. So it can be a thing that is a consideration for using vintage lenses over modern lenses. Now, you will almost certainly have to spend extra money to get these lenses ready for work for video, whether that be modding it by adding gears, switching out the mount, and adding on front rings, or going the much more expensive route of actually rehousing lenses. Now, rehousing lenses is quite the investment, because after talking to all the major lens rehousers, being TK Lenses, White Point Optics, and this one, which I forgot here, all of them quote around 14 to 20K to rehouse 4 lenses, which that's pretty wild. And it would take about 6 to 8 months. So my primary lenses that I use for my work would be just out of my hands for quite a long time and for quite a lot of money. But they do actually enhance lenses when you do that. So it's an interesting proposition, but it's just a lot of money. And when they do enhance lenses, you lose part of your original character, because one of the things that most of these guys do is change out the aperture to more rounded apertures. So you lose that initial character. So going the rehousing way, it's a big investment, and the thing that you get out of it is those benefits I talked about when you actually have cine lenses, because they're going to put them in a new body. They're going to have very obvious markings to denote what they are. And I can see that being appealing for some, but it feels like more of a move for rental houses, you know? Like, I can't see most average people being like, yes, let me spend this 14 to 20K to rehouse these lenses, because if that were the case, if I wanted to spend that kind of money on lenses, I would just get multiple cine lens sets and then be happy with those, I guess. Now, I'll be totally honest, for all my vintage lenses that do open up past f2, they're not very usable. Like my 55 1.2, if you're using it past anything f2, so like 1.8, 1.4, and 1.2, it has a lot of extra things going on, which for specific scenarios could be cool, but for average filming scenarios, no. Like if you're looking at that kind of thing where you want to shoot wide open and have sharp imagery, sure, yeah, you're gonna need modern lenses, but realistically, how often do you need to be shooting a lot of your content with a cine lens that's manual focus at anything more than T or f2? That's just overkill. You're gonna make your focus puller want to jump off a cliff. And it's also just, in my opinion, detracting from everybody else's work. But hey, that's one cinematographer's opinion. I will say there is a certain leap of faith when you're investing in vintage lenses, as most of their qualities and quirks aren't as well documented. It's not like if you're gonna go buy Vespids or Arls or Athenas or any of these modern lenses where you can see 1,000,001 videos about what they've got going on and how they work. Like if you wanted to go get some Super Tachymars or these Nikon lenses or like the original Zeiss planar set, any of that stuff, you kind of have to take a bit of a leap of faith or hope that someone forever ago had good documentation of how this works. So you do kind of have to sight unseen it sometimes, and that's rough. But in the case of these lenses here that I purchased, I just saw them. Something about them spoke to me, and I said, yeah, that's the one I want to go with, and I'm glad I did. Now after this, you might say, what about modern lenses that are detuned? To which I say, what about them? all these lenses are trying to emulate being vintage without the key things that make something feel vintage, right? One of the key things first is that they don't have polygonal aperture shapes. We're still rocking with these mostly round aperture blades, okay? There's no optical formula change that actually feels like something vintage. Again, like I previously spoke about, where vintage lenses have fewer elements and element groupings, and all these modern lenses have a lot of element and element groupings. And then most of the time, all they're doing is changing coding to do something that feels vintage. And yes, the coding can make a big difference, but it's not enough of a difference to really feel vintage. It's not like when somebody's filming with Panavision lenses from the original like C series that definitely feel different from modern T series. You know, that kind of thing. Yes, that's a very extreme example, but the point stands. The original glass feels original, whereas new glass is trying to feel original. And on top of this, detuning lenses, no matter which way you slice it, costs more than the original lenses. If you were to buy the Athenas and then buy the Athena detune, whatever it's called, it's gonna cost you more money. What could you have done? Buy vintage lenses. And say you wanna buy like modern lenses, clean lenses, and then get a detuner, you're still spending more money. So why go through all the extra effort of detuning lenses when you can just buy vintage lenses? And yes, again, there's a lot of trade-offs with going to vintage lenses, but I think some of those trade-offs are worth saving a lot more money. Now, I don't say this to be a lens snob, but I think that if you're gonna charge more for a lens to feel vintage, something more than a coding change has to happen to actually eschew that vintage character. Now, something I do hope for is the proliferation of more companies like Thypoch, Xelmus, and Light Lens Lab that are taking the initiative to take antiquated lens designs and put them into modern lenses that can more easily be acquired. So like in the case of Thypoch, they took those old Leica lenses, I don't remember which series they are, but they took those and put them into modern lenses that are more usable for today's purposes. And more importantly, is that they took those old lenses and put them into cinema bodies. So they're actually conducive to this kind of workflow. And then Xelmus took Panavision's old anamorphic formulas and put them into more modern lenses that can actually be purchased, because you know, Panavision, you can't buy Panavision lenses. And then like Lens Lab, they're ripping more photo lenses. That's kind of their thing right now. But if they did step into the market of making cine lenses, they would have interesting designs, as their whole thing was taking the old Cooke Pancro like optical formula and put that back into modern lens designs. So if more companies could do that kind of thing, it'd be fascinating. We could get real vintage optics in modern bodies, which I feel like that's something that a lot of people are asking for, and these companies are playing at, but they're not fully committing to. You know, ultimately though, I think one of the real reasons I'm gonna continue to use my vintage lenses is that they continue to scratch the itch of what I'm looking for in a lens. If the day ever came that a modern lens had what I was looking for, then yeah, I would go for it. But right now, these vintage lenses are here, and right now, they give me what I want. So yeah, I'm gonna continue to rock them. I think that's gonna be doing it for us today. If you like what you saw here, make sure you, of course, you drop a like, get subscribed, and comment below. Tell me what your thoughts on modern versus vintage lenses is. I would love to know. But until next time, I'm Yeshaya, this is FireFace Films, and we'll see you in the next one.